The rain was relentless, a steady downpour that turned the winding country road into a slick ribbon of asphalt. The headlights of Sarah's car cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-soaked world in brief flashes. She hadn't planned on taking this route, but the GPS had insisted it was faster. A shortcut, it had claimed. It didn't feel like one. The road was narrow, hemmed in by towering trees whose gnarled branches reached out like skeletal hands. Her fingers tightened on the wheel as she glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. She was already late. Her mother would be worried, but there was no cell service out here to let her know. The isolation was oppressive, the rain tapping an erratic rhythm against the windshield. As she rounded another curve, her high beams caught a figure standing on the roadside. A man, soaked through, waving frantically. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood. Sarah's heart skipped. Logic told her to keep driving. This was no place to stop, not for anyone. But as she passed him, the look of desperation in his stance pulled at her conscience. Against her better judgment, she slowed the car to a stop a few feet ahead. He jogged up to her window, his movements jerky and uneven. Rain streamed down his face as he lowered his hood, revealing hollow cheeks and wide, darting eyes. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "My car broke down. I need to get to the next town." Sarah hesitated. There was something off about him. His eyes didn't quite meet hers, and his hands fidgeted at his sides. Still, leaving him out here in this storm felt cruel. She unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in without a word of thanks, dripping water onto the seat. The silence was heavy as they drove. The man stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to ease the tension. "Doesn't matter," he replied quickly, his tone sharp. Her grip on the wheel tightened. She noticed his clothes weren't just wet. They were dirty, stained with something dark. Mud, maybe. She hoped it was mud. They continued in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the car. The rain was deafening now, a constant roar that drowned out her thoughts. Then she saw it, another figure on the side of the road. A woman this time, her dress clinging to her body, her hair plastered to her face. She was waving, her movements frantic. Sarah slowed instinctively, but the man beside her grabbed her arm. "Don't stop," he hissed. His grip was ice cold, his fingers digging into her skin. "Why not? She needs help," Sarah protested, but the look in his eyes silenced her. They were wild, filled with something primal and terrified. "She's not what you think," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Keep driving." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Against every instinct, she pressed the gas pedal, the woman's figure disappearing into the rearview mirror. She glanced at the man. His head was turned sharply, watching the road behind them. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. The road stretched on, the rain showing no signs of letting up. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She just wanted to reach the next town, to drop this man off and forget any of this had happened. But then, she saw them again. The same woman, standing in the exact same spot, waving just as desperately. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't possible. They had driven miles since she last saw her. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Drive," the man said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah obeyed, her mind racing. Her headlights cut through the rain, but the shadows seemed to move on their own now, twisting and writhing at the edges of her vision. The man sat rigid beside her, muttering under his breath. She caught snippets of his words. "Not real. Can't look. Not again." The trees thinned suddenly, and Sarah felt a flicker of relief. But as they emerged into an open stretch, her headlights illuminated something that made her blood run cold. Figures lined the road on both sides, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all soaked, all waving frantically. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. "Don't look at them," the man shouted, grabbing the wheel and forcing her gaze forward. The car swerved dangerously, but she managed to keep it on the road. The figures didn't move, but she could feel their eyes on her, pressing down like a physical weight. "What are they?" She cried, her voice breaking. "They're lost," the man said. "And they want you to join them." The figures grew denser as they drove, some stepping into the road, forcing her to swerve. The man's grip on her arm never loosened, his voice a constant stream of frantic instructions. "Don't stop. Don't look. Don't speak." Finally, a pair of lights appeared in the distance, a gas station. its neon sign flickering weakly. Sarah's relief was so overwhelming she almost sobbed. She pulled into the lot, the figures vanishing the moment the car left the road. The man jumped out before the car had fully stopped. He didn't thank her, didn't look back. He just disappeared into the darkness. Sarah sat there, trembling, her hands glued to the wheel. She didn't sleep that night, and she never took a shortcut again. It was supposed to be a simple drive. Tony had left the city late, the distant glow of skyscrapers fading in his rearview mirror as he headed into the countryside. The open road stretched before him, an endless black ribbon cutting through fields and forests. He liked these drives at night, the solitude and quiet a balm after long days at work. Tonight, though, something felt off. The air in the car was stifling despite the cool breeze outside, and an uneasy tension prickled at his skin. As he passed a wooden sign announcing, "Welcome to Braxton Hollow," Tony glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:37 a.m. The road narrowed, the streetlights becoming scarce until there was nothing but his headlights piercing the darkness. The trees loomed taller here, their shadows twisting and curling in ways that made his chest tighten. The first oddity appeared just as he rounded a bend, a rusted sedan parked haphazardly at the side of the road. Its headlights were off, and the driver's side door hung open. Tony slowed, his brow furrowing as he scanned the area. There was no sign of anyone. The car was old, too old. Its peeling paint and flat tires suggested it had been there for years. But the mud beneath it was fresh, dark and wet, as if the car had just been driven through. Unnerved, Tony pressed the gas and continued. The unease followed him like a shadow. A mile later, he saw them. 3 figures standing in the middle of the road. They were perfectly still, their backs to him, silhouetted by his headlights. 2 adults and a child, all dressed in plain, outdated clothes. Tony slowed, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. "Hey!" he called through his open window, though his voice sounded thin and weak in the thick silence. The figures didn't move. He tapped the horn lightly. Still no reaction. Their rigid posture unsettled him. The way their heads were tilted slightly, almost unnaturally, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. A deep instinct told him not to stop. Instead, he steered carefully around them, his car crawling as he avoided hitting the child. Just as his front bumper passed them, the child's head snapped toward him. Tony's breath caught in his throat. The boy's face was pale and expressionless, his eyes too wide, too empty, as if they'd never seen light. Before he could process what he was seeing, the figures disappeared into his rearview mirror. He hit the gas, his tires screeching on the wet pavement. The road seemed endless now, winding and narrow. The trees pressed closer, their branches clawing at the sides of his car. Every so often, Tony thought he saw movement among the trunks, a flash of white, a flicker of shadow. But when he looked, there was nothing. Then came the thumping. It started faint, like a soft knock, somewhere near the back of the car. Tony glanced in the rearview mirror, his stomach lurching. The back seat was empty. He forced himself to focus on the road, dismissing it as a stray branch or the car settling. But the sound grew louder, rhythmic, insistent. Thump, thump, thump. He swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the wheel. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself. "Just keep driving." The next sound shattered his resolve, a long, dragging scrape across the roof of the car as if fingernails were raking the metal. Tony slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. He sat frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Get out and look," his mind whispered, though every fiber of his being screamed against it. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. The moment his fingers touched it, a face appeared at the driver's side window. It was the child, but it wasn't. The face was wrong, the skin too smooth, too pale, the features blurred like a smeared painting. The eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto his, and a thin, too wide smile stretched across the boy's face. Tony screamed, jerking the car into gear. The child's hand slapped against the window as the car sped off, his hollow laughter ringing in Tony's ears. The sound didn't fade as he drove. It followed him, a haunting echo that seemed to seep into his very bones. He didn't stop until he saw the lights of a small diner on the side of the road. His hands shook as he pulled into the lot and stumbled out of the car. The night was quiet now, the rain a gentle patter on the pavement. He burst into the diner, drawing startled looks from the handful of patrons inside. Someone's out there," he gasped, his voice trembling. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, exchanged a glance with the cook behind the counter. "You took the Braxton Hollow Road?" she asked. Tony nodded, still struggling to catch his breath. She sighed, setting down the coffee pot in her hand. "You're not the first. Folks around here know better than to drive that way at night. Strange things happen on that road." "What kind of things?" Tony demanded, his voice rising. The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "People see things, hear things. Some don't make it out at all." She shook her head. "You're lucky you got here." Tony didn't feel lucky. He glanced back at his car, sitting alone in the lot. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow move behind the fogged-up windows, but when he blinked, it was gone. The gas station was nearly empty when Lila pulled in, her fuel gauge needle teetering on E. She'd been driving for hours, trying to make it back home before midnight, but the sprawling back roads seemed to twist endlessly, each turn looking the same as the last. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered, casting an eerie glow over the pumps and the lone convenience store. She parked next to the nearest pump, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. It was unsettlingly quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of the station's old lights. A chill ran down her spine, and she wrapped her jacket tighter around herself as she began fueling. "Late night drive?" a voice called out. Lila jumped, her hand clutching her chest. The station attendant was standing at the door of the convenience store, watching her. He was older, his face deeply lined, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," Lila said, forcing a smile. "Long way to go still." The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her for a beat too long. "Be careful out there. Roads get strange this time of night." She chuckled nervously. "I'll keep that in mind." The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Lila hurriedly replaced the nozzle and got back into her car, eager to put some distance between herself and the unsettling old man. As she pulled out onto the empty highway, she noticed him still standing there, watching her drive away. The road stretched out endlessly ahead, swallowed by the dark woods on either side. The further she went, the more oppressive the darkness became. Her headlights barely seemed to cut through it, as if the night was alive and pushing back against the light. Lila turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction, but all she got was static. She fiddled with the dial, searching for a station, but the static only grew louder, hissing and crackling like whispers just beyond comprehension. She turned it off. The road seemed to narrow as the trees crept closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moon. Lila glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:13 a.m. She swore it had been 12:13 for a while now. A flash of movement caught her eye. Something darted across the road ahead, too fast to make out. She slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a halt. Her heart pounded as she stared into the darkness, her headlights illuminating nothing but the empty road and the looming trees. It was probably a deer, she muttered to herself, though she didn't quite believe it. She pressed the gas, the tires crunching over gravel as the car picked up speed. But the uneasy feeling in her gut grew heavier. Every so often she thought she saw shadows moving at the edges of her vision, shapes that seemed to melt back into the darkness before she could focus on them. Then the figure appeared. A man was standing in the middle of the road, his back to her, completely still. Lila screamed, slamming on the brakes again. The car screeched to a stop, mere feet from him. Her hands trembled on the wheel as she stared at his silhouette, illuminated in her high beams. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that seemed strangely outdated. She honked the horn, but he didn't move. "Get out of the way," she yelled, though her voice barely carried in the silence. The man didn't react. His head was slightly tilted as though he were listening for something. The air in the car grew heavy, suffocating. Lila's pulse thundered in her ears as she threw the car into reverse, intending to back up and go around him. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath caught in her throat. There was another figure standing behind her car. This one was a woman, her head hanging at an unnatural angle, her hair matted and covering her face. She stood barefoot on the asphalt, her white dress smeared with dark stains. Lila's heart raced as panic gripped her. She was trapped, the man in front of her, the woman behind her, both completely still, as though waiting for her to do something. With a surge of desperation, she hit the gas, swerving to avoid the man in the road. Her car fishtailed but regained traction, speeding down the highway. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again, but she could feel them, feel their presence pressing in on her, their unseen eyes boring into the back of her head. The road grew more twisted, the turns sharper, the trees impossibly dense. Her headlights began to flicker, plunging her into moments of darkness that felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the road opened up. She saw lights in the distance. A town. Safety. Lila pulled into the nearest parking lot, her chest heaving as she tried to calm down. The car's engine sputtered and died, smoke curling from the hood. She stumbled out, her legs weak, and made her way toward the small diner ahead. Inside, the warm light and soft chatter of patrons was a balm to her frayed nerves. She sank into a booth, her hands still shaking as she picked up the menu. The waitress approached, her kind smile a welcome relief. "Rough night?" she asked. Lila nodded. "You have no idea. I think something was on the road. I don't even know what it was." The waitress's smile faltered. "You came from the highway, didn't you?" Lila looked up, confused. "Yeah, why?" The waitress's expression grew grave. "You're not the first. That stretch of road, things happen out there. People see things. Sometimes they don't come back." Lila opened her mouth to respond, but a sound behind her made her blood run cold, a soft, familiar thump. She turned slowly, her heart freezing in her chest. The man in the suit was standing outside the diner, his face pressed against the glass, staring directly at her. Behind him, the woman in white lingered in the shadows, her head still at that impossible angle. They had followed her. The old stretch of Black Ridge Highway was infamous, though not for the reasons most would assume. No grisly accidents, no urban legends of ghostly hitchhikers, just a reputation for making people uneasy. Still, Jess had no choice but to take it. She was running late, and Black Ridge was the fastest route to her sister's house. The highway was desolate, the kind of dark where the only illumination came from her high beam slicing through the void. The tall pines on either side of the road stood like sentinels, their branches reaching high into the night. Jess adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to shake the strange feeling that had been clawing at her since she turned onto the road. At first, it was subtle, a faint thud somewhere under the car, like she'd run over something. She frowned, glancing in the mirror. The road behind her was empty, no bumps, no debris. Shrugging it off, she pressed on, the tires humming against the asphalt. The thud came again, louder, closer. This time it wasn't from under the car, it sounded like it came from the trunk. Jess glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:42 p.m. Her heart quickened. She hadn't stopped anywhere, hadn't picked up anyone or anything. Yet the noise continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. "It's nothing, just something loose," she muttered, though the words felt hollow. The thud stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Jess exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But then she felt it, a shift in the weight of the car, as though someone or something was moving in the trunk. Her breath hitched. She glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see a figure sitting behind her. The back seat was empty, but her reflection showed a pale, anxious face staring back at her. She debated pulling over, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black night made her stomach churn. Instead, she pressed harder on the gas, hoping to reach her destination faster. Then the radio crackled. Jess hadn't touched it. She never even turned it on. Static hissed through the speakers, broken by faint whispers. She froze, her eyes darting to the radio as the whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices that she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. Her skin crawled. She reached out a trembling hand to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The voices built to a deafening crescendo, then stopped abruptly, leaving only static. The relief was short-lived. The rearview mirror caught movement. This time, she saw it, a shape in the back seat. Jess screamed, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching. Her heart pounded as she turned, expecting to see someone, or something, looming behind her. Nothing. The back seat was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She looked out the windows, scanning the dark woods that pressed against the road. Still nothing. Shaking, she turned back to the wheel, ready to floor it and never look back. But her blood ran cold. In the windshield's reflection, she saw a figure. It was sitting in the back seat now, its face obscured by shadow, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as though its neck had been snapped. Jess couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Slowly, its head turned toward her, and two dark, hollow eyes locked onto hers. Her scream echoed into the empty night as the windshield suddenly spiderwebbed with cracks, a force smashing into it from the inside. She didn't wait. Jess threw the car into drive, the engine roaring as she sped down the highway, tears streaming down her face. The figure didn't disappear. It stayed in the back seat, unmoving, its eyes boring into her. The car began to rattle violently, the steering wheel jerking in her hands. The headlights flickered, the darkness outside closing in like a living thing. Jess's vision blurred as the speedometer needle climbed higher and higher, and then it all stopped. The car rolled to a gentle halt, its engine silent. The night was still, the woods eerily quiet. Jess sat frozen, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The figure was gone, the windshield unbroken. She let out a shaky laugh, half hysteria, half relief. "I'm losing it," she whispered. Her phone buzzed. She snatched it up, grateful for the distraction. It was a message from her sister. "Are you close? Be careful on Blackridge. There's been a lot of weird stuff happening there. People go missing." Jess's stomach dropped. Her hands shook as she typed back a reply. "Weird how?" The reply came almost instantly. "They say people see things, sometimes figures in their car. If you see something, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." Jess's heart stopped as her phone screen went dark. But before she could react, a quiet, familiar sound broke the silence. Thunk from the trunk. The narrow, winding road through Old Hollow Pass was notorious for its sharp turns and dense fog. But Emily wasn't worried. She'd driven it dozens of times on her way to the family cabin. Tonight, though, something felt different. The fog was thicker than usual, swallowing her headlights in a white abyss, and the road seemed quieter, too quiet. No animals rustling in the woods, no chirping insects, just the low hum of her engine and the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel. The clock on her dashboard read 11:48 p.m. She tightened her grip on the wheel. The cabin wasn't far now, just another 20 minutes. She kept telling herself that as the road curved sharply, each turn revealing nothing but more fog and trees. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the eerie silence. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her sister. "Did you leave for the cabin yet? Don't take Old Hollow Pass." Emily frowned, her stomach tightening. She hadn't told her sister she'd be driving this way. She picked up the phone to reply, but thought better of it. She needed to focus on the road. That's when she saw the first shape. It was barely visible at first, just a shadow shifting in the fog. Emily slowed down, squinting through the windshield. A figure was standing by the edge of the road, hunched over as if they were hurt. She brought the car to a crawl, her pulse quickening. The figure raised its head. It was a man, pale, gaunt, and dressed in clothes that looked decades old. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and unblinking. Emily froze, her foot hovering over the brake. Something about his gaze was wrong. He took a step toward the car. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving. She pressed the gas and sped past him, her rearview mirror catching one last glimpse of his figure dissolving into the fog. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel, her mind racing. "Just someone messing around," she muttered to herself, though the explanation felt thin. The road stretched on, the fog thicker than ever. Then came the sound. A faint tapping at first, barely audible over the engine. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the car, it was coming from the passenger side window. Emily whipped her head around. The same man was outside the car, running alongside it, his face pressed to the glass. His empty eyes stared at her, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. She screamed, slamming the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring as she left him behind. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved, circling the car, first on the driver's side, then the roof, then the back window. Knock, 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 knock. Her breathing came in panicked gasps as she fought to keep control of the car. The fog seemed alive now, curling and twisting around her vehicle, obscuring the road ahead. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily risked a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man. But the road behind her was empty. She exhaled shakily, her muscles aching from tension. She was just starting to calm down when the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, interspersed with faint, garbled voices. One of them cut through, clear and chilling. "You shouldn't have stopped." Emily's blood ran cold. She hadn't stopped. Had she? Her mind raced, trying to remember. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was louder, closer. "You let him in." Her heart stopped. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, and this time she wasn't alone. A face stared back at her, pale and grinning, its hollow eyes boring into hers. It was in the back seat. Emily screamed, swerving wildly. The car veered off the road, crashing into the trees with a deafening crunch. The world spun, and then everything went black. When she woke up, the car was upside down, the windshield shattered, the fog seeping into the wreck. Her head throbbed and her vision blurred, but she was alive. Barely. A figure stood just outside the broken window, watching her. It was him. His grin was wider now, stretching impossibly across his face. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could only watch as he knelt down, his empty eyes meeting hers. "You shouldn't have taken Old Hollow Pass?" he whispered, his voice low and cold. Then he reached for her. The storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected, turning the winding country road into a maze of blinding rain and howling wind. Rachel clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white as the wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour, just endless stretches of trees and the occasional flicker of lightning illuminating the road ahead. Her phone buzzed on the console, but when she glanced at the screen, the signal was gone. Great, lost in the middle of nowhere in a storm with no GPS. She sighed, trying to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught something on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. He was soaking wet, his head bowed, one hand clutching a small suitcase. His other hand was raised, thumb outstretched. Rachel slowed down instinctively, her eyes narrowing. The man didn't look up, even as her car approached. Something about him felt wrong. Her foot hovered over the brake, but she hesitated. The rain pounded on the roof, masking any sound. Rachel glanced at the empty passenger seat, then back at the man. His head was still bowed, his face obscured by the rain and shadows. "Just keep driving," a voice in her head whispered. She hit the gas, her car splashing through puddles as she passed him. But as her taillights faded into the storm, guilt began to gnaw at her. What if he really needed help? What if she left him out here to die in the cold? She glanced in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, no sign of the man. Rachel shook her head. Maybe he'd stepped back into the trees, or maybe she'd imagined him entirely. She drove on, her nerves jangling with every flash of lightning and gust of wind that buffeted the car. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the roar of the storm. A soft thud, 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 like something tapping on the trunk. She frowned, glancing in the mirror again. The rain streaked across the glass, distorting her view, but the road behind her was still empty. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Rachel's pulse quickened. She turned down the radio, straining to listen. The sound was coming from inside the car. Her breath hitched. She flicked on the overhead light, twisting to look at the back seat. Nothing, just her backpack and a jacket. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved now, sliding from the trunk to the roof, a dragging sound that made her skin crawl. Rachel gripped the wheel tighter, her heart pounding. "It's just the wind," she muttered, though she didn't believe it. The next sound froze her blood, a low, deliberate knock on the driver's side window. Rachel's head snapped toward the sound. The hitchhiker was standing there, his face inches from the glass. His eyes were wide, empty, and staring straight at her. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She screamed, slamming the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires skidding on the wet pavement. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sped down the road, the rain hammering against the windows. She didn't dare look back. But the knocking came again. This time it was on the back window. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach twisting. He was there, sitting in the back seat, his hollow eyes fixed on hers through the mirror. Rachel's scream tore through the car as she swerved wildly, the tires losing traction. The car spun, careening off the road and into the ditch. The impact was jarring, the windshield shattering as the car came to a grinding halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel blinked, her vision blurry. Blood trickled down her forehead, but she was alive. She fumbled with the seatbelt, her shaking hands struggling to release the latch. She had to get out. She had to run. But before she could move, she heard it again. The tapping. Slow. Deliberate. She turned her head, her heart hammering in her chest. The hitchhiker was crouched outside the driver's side window, his grin wider now, stretching impossibly across his face. "Going my way?" he whispered, his voice low and cold. The last thing Rachel saw was his hand reaching for the shattered glass. The old highway stretched endlessly through the barren desert, a straight shot of cracked asphalt illuminated only by the dim glow of Harper's headlights. She had been driving for hours, the loneliness of the road settling into her bones. The only company she had was the occasional tumbleweeds skittering across the pavement. Her gas gauge hovered near empty, the needle dangerously close to the red. She scanned the horizon, hoping to spot the warm glow of a gas station. But the desert offered nothing except shadows and silence. Just as panic began to creep in, a neon light flickered in the distance. Harper exhaled in relief. A gas station. The place was old, its sign weathered and buzzing faintly. She pulled up to the pump, the gravel crunching under her tires. There was no attendant, just an ancient pump and a single light illuminating the cracked concrete. The small convenience store was dark, its windows reflecting the dim light like hollow eyes. Harper stepped out of the car, the night air cool against her skin. She inserted her credit card into the pump, her eyes flicking nervously to the dark store. It felt like something was watching her, though the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. The pump clicked, signaling that her tank was full. She replaced the nozzle and turned to get back into her car, but froze. There was a figure standing in the distance, barely visible at the edge of the light. It was tall and still, like a shadow that had stepped out of the ground. Harper squinted, her heart racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its outline barely distinguishable from the night. Harper's throat tightened. She quickly got into her car, locking the doors. As she started the engine, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was closer now, standing just at the edge of the gas station's light. Her blood ran cold. Without thinking, she threw the car into drive and sped off, the tires screeching against the gravel. Her heart pounded as the station disappeared in her rearview mirror. But the road wasn't empty. A few miles down, her headlights caught another figure standing in the middle of the road. Harper slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The figure was the same, tall, still, and featureless. Her hands trembled on the wheel. She swerved around it and kept driving, the knot of fear tightening in her chest. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the road for more of them. And then she saw it. A line of figures stretching endlessly along the road ahead. They stood on either side, perfectly still, their heads turning slowly to watch her as she passed. Her breathing grew ragged, her pulse deafening in her ears. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't. But no matter how far she drove, the figures remained, lining the road, their unblinking gaze fixed on her. Then the static started. The radio crackled, though she hadn't turned it on. A low, distorted voice whispered through the speakers. "You can't leave." Harper's hands shook as she tried to turn the radio off, but the voice grew louder. "You're already here." The engine sputtered and the car began to slow. Harper slammed the gas pedal, but it was no use. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, the figures drawing closer, the headlights flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Her screams echoed into the void as the shadows closed in. The forest road was the kind of place that GPS would tell you didn't exist, a forgotten path that seemed to stretch into nowhere. Claire had been driving for hours, the winding road lined with dense, towering trees that blotted out the moonlight. Her friends had warned her about taking shortcuts through unfamiliar areas, but she'd brushed it off. "I'll save time," she'd said. Now she wasn't so sure. Her car's headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, casting long, spindly shadows that seemed to reach for the car. The clock on the dashboard read 12:13 a.m. She hadn't seen another car, another person, or even an animal for miles, just the endless woods and the gravel road crunching beneath her tires. That's when she noticed the sign. It was old and weathered, its paint peeling, but the word "stop" was still visible. Below it, another sign dangled, barely readable. "Turn back now." Claire chuckled nervously. "Cliché much?" she muttered, but a chill ran down her spine. She pressed on, convincing herself it was just a prank or an abandoned property warning. A few minutes later, she spotted something strange on the side of the road, a blackened tree stump, charred and skeletal. It stood out starkly against the lush greenery, as if it didn't belong. As she drove further, there were more of them. Burnt trees and scorched earth, patches of ash dotting the roadside. Her stomach tightened. She turned up the radio to drown out the unease, but the signal was nothing but static. Frustrated, she turned it off. That's when she saw movement in the rearview mirror. It was brief, a flicker in the corner of her eye. A figure, darting across the road behind her car. Claire's breath caught in her throat, and she glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the empty road. Her heart raced as she tightened her grip on the wheel. "It's just my imagination," she whispered. But deep down, she didn't believe it. The road twisted sharply, and as her car rounded the bend, the headlights illuminated something that made her blood run cold. A woman stood in the middle of the road. She was barefoot, her long, tangled hair obscuring her face, and she wore a tattered white dress that hung off her thin frame. Claire slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a stop just feet from the figure. The woman didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Claire's heart pounded as she rolled down the window slightly, her voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing hollow, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light, her lips curled into a chilling, unnatural smile. Claire's chest tightened as deep guttural voice, not the woman's, whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Claire didn't wait. She floored the gas pedal, swerving around the figure, her car skidding on the gravel before regaining traction. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. The road behind her was empty. Her hands shook as she drove faster, the trees whipping past in a blur. The scorched patches of earth grew larger, spreading like a disease through the forest. Smoke began to curl along the edges of the road, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the car rolled to a stop. "No, no, no," Claire cried, turning the key in desperation. The engine wouldn't start. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Panic set in as the smoke thickened, curling around the car like a living thing. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, like fingernails against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the passenger side window. Claire's breath caught as she turned her head, and her heart nearly stopped. The woman was there, her face pressed against the glass, grinning wider now, her hollow eyes staring into Claire's soul. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it was a cacophony of pounding. Claire screamed, fumbling to lock the doors, but the woman disappeared. The pounding stopped. The smoke was gone. She sat in silence, her chest heaving, trying to convince herself it was over. But then she felt it, a cold breath against the back of her neck. A voice whispered in her ear, low and malevolent. "You can't leave." Claire's scream echoed through the forest as the car filled with darkness. The road was silent once more. The rain fell in a steady, relentless rhythm, drumming against the windshield as Ethan navigated the narrow, twisting backroads. His GPS had failed hours ago, and the map app was useless in the dead zone of these forgotten woods. He had no choice but to keep driving and hope for a sign, a town, a gas station, anything. The road narrowed even more, the trees leaning in like they wanted to close over the car. Every now and then, the headlights would catch a pair of eyes in the underbrush, deer, raccoons, or something else. Ethan tried not to think about what else might be out there. He checked his watch. 1:22 a.m., too late to turn back. His fuel gauge was hovering just above empty when he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. A woman, soaked from the rain, her dark hair clinging to her face. She wore a simple dress that hung heavily with water, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Ethan slowed the car, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't want to stop. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going, but something about her made him pause. What if she was in trouble? Alone out here in the middle of nowhere? He rolled down the passenger window just enough to speak over the rain. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her head was tilted slightly, and her face was obscured by her wet hair. Unease crawled up Ethan's spine, but he tried again. "Do you need help?" Slowly, she raised her head. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her lips were a strange shade of blue. She stared at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. Without a word, she stepped off the road and disappeared into the trees. Ethan's skin prickled. He waited for a few moments, unsure of what to do, before rolling up the window and driving away. His foot pressed harder on the gas than he intended, and the car's engine whined as it picked up speed. The rain seemed louder now, each drop hammering the roof like a warning. He hadn't gone far when he noticed the smell. A faint, sickly sweet odor wafted through the car, growing stronger by the second. It was cloying, like rotting flowers mixed with damp earth. Ethan gagged, glancing at the vents as if the smell might be coming from the air system, but there was nothing. Then he saw her, in the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat, her head tilted at the same unnatural angle, her wet hair dripping onto the seat. Her blue lips parted, and a low, raspy whisper filled the car. "You shouldn't have stopped." Ethan slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the slick road. When it came to a halt, he whipped around, but the back seat was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "It's just stress," he muttered to himself. "The rain, the dark, I'm just tired." He put the car back in drive and started moving again, slower this time, his eyes flicking nervously between the road and the mirror. The smell lingered, faint but undeniable. The road twisted and turned, and the rain refused to let up. He was beginning to think he'd be stuck out here all night when his headlights illuminated something ahead. A house. It was old and weathered, but there were lights on inside. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the driveway. At least he could ask for directions or use a phone. He stepped out of the car, the rain soaking him instantly. The smell of rotting flowers was stronger now, almost overpowering. Ethan hurried to the door and knocked. The wood felt soft, damp, as if it might crumble under his fist. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. "Hello?" he called out, stepping inside. "Is anyone home?" The air inside was thick and heavy, the smell suffocating. The house was silent except for the faint dripping of water. A wet footprint appeared on the floor ahead of him, then another, as if someone was walking just out of sight. "Hello," he said again, his voice shaking. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway, and then she stepped into view. The woman from the road. Her pale face was illuminated by the flickering light, her blue lips curling into a smile. Ethan stumbled backward, his back hitting the door. What do you want?" he stammered. She tilted her head, her hair falling away to reveal her hollow black eyes. Her voice was a whisper, cold and dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have stopped." The door slammed shut behind him. The old, forgotten bridge loomed ahead, its rusty frame barely visible in the weak beams of Sam's headlights. The GPS had sent him this way, but as he approached the desolate structure, he couldn't shake the feeling that the device had made a terrible mistake. There was no sign of other cars, no sign of life at all, just the sound of his tires crunching over the gravel and the relentless wind howling through the trees. He hesitated at the edge of the bridge, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of his car. A faded sign to the side read, "Cross at your own risk." Sam swallowed hard, glancing at his gas gauge. He didn't have enough fuel to turn back and find another route. The engine rumbled as he eased the car onto the bridge. It groaned and shuddered under the weight, the boards beneath his tires flexing with every inch forward. The sound echoed in the oppressive silence, amplified by the chasm below. Halfway across, his car's headlights flickered. Sam's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he muttered, "Don't do this. Not now." Then they went out completely. Darkness swallowed him, thick and impenetrable. Sam fumbled with the light switch, his breath quickening. The headlights flickered back on, but when they did, his stomach dropped. A figure stood in the middle of the bridge, just a few feet ahead. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. Tall and thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something off about the way he stood, too still, as though he weren't human at all. Sam slammed the horn. The sound blared through the night, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head slightly as if studying him. Sam's pulse thundered in his ears. His foot pressed down on the gas, but the car didn't move. The engine sputtered, and "No," he shouted, twisting the key in the ignition. The car refused to start. His hands shook as he glanced up. The figure was closer now, though he hadn't seen it move. It stood just outside the car's hood, its head still tilted unnaturally. Sam locked the doors, his fingers trembling. The figure reached out a hand, long and pale, its fingers too thin and too long to belong to anything human. It dragged them slowly across the windshield, the sound of nails on glass making Sam's skin crawl. "Leave me alone!" he yelled, slamming his fists on the steering wheel. The figure's hand froze mid-drag, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the windshield shattered. Sam screamed as shards of glass rained down on him. The figure reached through the broken window, its hand inches from his face. He threw himself into the passenger seat, scrambling for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. He turned back toward the driver's seat, and the figure was gone. The wind roared through the shattered windshield, but the bridge was empty. Sam's heart pounded as he climbed back into the driver's seat, his shaking hands fumbling with the key. This time, the engine roared to life. He didn't question it. He slammed the gas pedal, speeding across the rest of the bridge, the car jostling violently on the uneven boards. He didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirror. The figure was gone. It had to be. But when he reached the other side of the bridge, relief didn't come. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the dense trees looming closer, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. His headlights illuminated another sign, identical to the one before the bridge. "Cross at your own risk." Sam's stomach turned as he realized he'd come full circle. He was back at the start, the same bridge looming ahead of him once more, and standing in the middle of it, waiting, was the figure. This time it smiled.